Okay, we're looking at objections to the modal ontological argument. The second objection, B, is the possibility of a necessary being is said to be analogous to the possibility of an unnecessary being. Various parodies have been constructed of the modal ontological argument using this objection. The strategy is to say that while the ontological argument goes through, the parallel argument proving the negation of the conclusion of the ontological argument goes through as well. Then the two arguments, the ontological and the ontological parody, or the anti-ontological argument, the two arguments would cancel each other out, if you want to put it in those terms. Now, one way to define an unnecessary being is to say that a possible being is unnecessary if and only if they know that all possible beings are not necessary. So the unnecessary being is not himself or herself impossible, rather he or she knows that all possible beings are not necessary. They don't he or she would know that all possible beings do not exist in every logically possible world. The question before us then is, which is more plausible? A necessary being is possible, that's the first option, or the second option, an unnecessary being is possible. So which of those two propositions do we think is more plausible? A necessary being or an unnecessary being is possible. As I've already indicated, I think that a necessary being is possible. For that reason alone, I would reject the plausibility of the possibility of an unnecessary being. But I could say more by way of critique of this second objection to the ontological argument. How can anybody know that there are no necessary beings? An omniscient being would certainly know that, but an omniscient being would be very much like a deity, and the modal ontological argument denier normally would be unwilling to concede the possibility of a deity, because if a deity is possible in this argument, a deity would be actual. So God would exist. But if we deny the modal ontological argument, then we don't want to admit that there is a God. If an unnecessary being is not omniscient, then they have to find a contradiction in the concept of a necessary being. But despite their best efforts, atheists in the actual world have not been able to do that so far. Moreover, we can point to necessary beings that the atheist should admit are possible, are actual even. The number 3, for example. So I think it is very implausible that an unnecessary being would possibly exist. And that brings us to the third objection, C. Positing the possibility of a necessary being begs the question. There is nothing in the conclusion of the modal ontological argument that is not already in the premises of the ontological argument. The skeptic tells us that as though it were a bad thing. But isn't that the nature of deductive arguments in general? Every argument in philosophy begs the question, if by beg the question you mean the conclusion is present in the premises, and the denier of the conclusion of the argument would reject the premises since they lead to a conclusion he or she does not accept. This is the sign of a good argument, not a bad one. So yes, like all arguments in the modal ontological argument, the premises do include, by implication, what is present in the conclusion, and people who want to deny the conclusion are going to deny the premises because they lead to that conclusion. But that doesn't mean the argument is begging the question. That's what all good arguments do. That's how arguments work in deductive logic. And the final objection is that existence is not a predicate. D, existence is not a predicate. This was the classic objection of Immanuel Kant to Anselm's non-modal ontological argument, the original ontological argument. So I don't think it really applies to the newer reformulation, the modal ontological argument. Nevertheless, this objection has been so influential historically, I thought I should address it here, even if just briefly. Now, Anselm himself never claimed that existence was a predicate. While positing existence does not seem to add anything to a concept, as Kant rightly pointed out, it seems to me that positing necessary existence does add something to a concept. Excuse me, a concept of a being is fundamentally different if the concept includes the idea of necessary existence. Kant's example of money, if you have the idea of a certain quantity of money, you don't add anything to the concept of money in and of itself if you say that it exists. But we're not talking about mere existence, we're talking about necessary existence. That would make the money, if money could be necessary, that would make it exist in every logically possible world. So that's a different concept of money than just money. It's not just a being, it's a being that must exist in every possible world. So you're adding, necessary existence is adding something to the concept of a thing. Alright, so none of the serious objections to the ontological argument are successful defeaters of it, and it seems the modal ontological argument for the existence of God is sound. So it does go through, despite what atheists say when they try to argue against it. Alright, so next we'll look at the cosmological argument, and then finally the teleological argument, and that will bring us to the end. So thank you for watching. Shalom to you all. Goodbye.